I'm going to tell you what happened at Verath Station. Not the version the Galactic Oversight Council published. Not the version that got sanitized down into 3 paragraphs in the Allied Worlds Treaty Review. Not the cleaned-up, diplomatic, carefully worded version that made the Kethral ambassadors sound reasonable and humanity sound like we simply overreacted to a security incident. That version is garbage. I was there. I watched it happen. I watched a man I'd known for 6 years, a man who could field strip a pulse rifle in the dark, who once carried a wounded Xyrath medic 3 kilometers through a radiation zone because the little guy was scared. I watched them put him on his knees. And then I watched them kill him. So no, I'm not going to give you the diplomatic version. I'm going to give you the real one. And when I'm done, maybe you'll understand why we did what we did. Maybe you'll understand why the 9th Orbital Marines, all 43 of us who were still breathing, spent the next 19 days turning the Kethral Sovereignty's most fortified station into rubble, wall by wall, corridor by corridor, room by room. Maybe you'll understand why not a single one of us hesitated. Let me start at the beginning. The 9th Orbital Marines were not a famous unit. That's important. That's actually really important, because a lot of people who have read the news reports, who have seen the dramatized feeds, they think we were some kind of elite Black Ops outfit. They think we were hand-picked killers, or that we had some kind of special hatred for the Kethral built into our training. We weren't any of that. We were a mid-tier rapid response unit stationed on the UEDC cruiser Inviolate, a ship that smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee no matter what deck you were on. We were the guys you called when something needed to be handled fast and without ceremony. Riots on mining colonies, evacuation escorts through contested corridors, prisoner transport, guard rotations at diplomatic stations that the brass considered safe enough that they didn't want to waste their fancy special forces units on. That last one, that's what got us to Verath Station. Verath Station was a mid-tier diplomatic waypoint in the outer rim of the Shattered Corridor, a stretch of space that had been contested between humanity and the Kethral Sovereignty for about 40 years before they finally agreed to stop shooting at each other and start arguing in rooms instead of in vacuum. The station itself was built jointly. Kethral architecture on the upper levels, all those sweeping crystalline spires they liked, those cathedral ceilings that made the light do strange things, like standing inside a prism that someone had accidentally filled with incense smoke. Human construction on the lower levels, functional, utilitarian, slightly ugly, exactly the way we build things when we're focused on the job rather than the aesthetic. The Oversight Council had been meeting there for 6 months when we arrived. Our assignment was simple: rotate in as the human security contingent, stand watches, escort human dignitaries when they moved between sections. Don't start anything. Don't end anything. Don't give the Kethral any excuse to walk away from the table. Standard babysitting. We'd done it before. There were 47 of us when we arrived, 3 standard fire teams plus support personnel. Our commanding officer was Captain Alara Voss, a compact, precise woman who wore her gray-streaked hair in a tight knot and had a look she deployed at subordinates who were about to do something stupid. It was a very specific look. It had layers. I'd been on the receiving end of it enough times to know exactly how many layers it had. Then there was Fire Team Crucible. That's my team. Myself, Sergeant Dominic Reyes. You can call me Dom. Everyone does, though new people usually start with Sergeant until they figure out I don't care either way. I'm 34 years old. I've been with the Marines for 12 years, and I have a bad knee that I never reported to medical because I didn't want to get grounded. Corporal Ewan Packho, we called him Ewan or sometimes the Professor, because the man read constantly. Physical books. Actual paper books that he'd accumulated over 3 deployments and kept wrapped in a waterproof case that he guarded with the intensity most soldiers reserved for ammunition. He read philosophy mostly, and military history, and sometimes, he admitted this only once, poetry. Private First Class Renata Solis Rio to everyone who knew her, 26 years old, from a family of fishermen on the southern coast of what used to be Colombia. She had this way of sizing people up the first time she met them, real quick, real quiet, and then she'd either relax or she wouldn't. She was the best shot in the unit. Better than me. Better than anyone on the Inviolate, and I'll say that without hesitation. And Private Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb, 23 years old, from a small town in what used to be rural England, one of those places where the name on the map was older than most Earth civilizations. He'd grown up watching feeds about the expansion, about humanity's first contact wars, about the Kethral and the Zyrath and the Von, and all the others we'd stumbled into out here in the dark. He joined the Marines at 18 because he genuinely believed, and this wasn't naive, this wasn't performance, this was bone-deep belief, that humanity needed people willing to stand in hard places and hold the line. He was the kind of soldier who would ask the cooks how they were doing, who would check on the junior enlisted when things got tense, who carried pictures of his little sister folded in his front chest pocket and would get embarrassed if anyone saw him looking at them. He was 23 years old. I keep coming back to that, 23. The first 3 weeks at Varath were routine. The Kethral security contingent was professional. Cold, the way they always were, their emotional register ran at a different frequency than ours, quieter and more controlled, which humans tended to misread as hostility when it was really just different. Their secondary eyes, the amber ones that sat just above the main pair, tracked everything with an unsettling constancy, the kind of attention that made you feel like you were being cataloged. But they didn't start trouble. They maintained their watch rotations. They stayed on their side of the neutral corridors. We stayed on ours. The diplomats talked. The Oversight Council met. The Kethral delegation sat across the table from the human delegation, and they argued about trade corridor access and territorial buffer zones, and the mining rights on 3 moons that both sides had legitimate historical claims to, and neither side was willing to give up. We watched doorways. We walked corridors. We drank bad coffee and slept in rotation and checked our equipment and waited for the weeks to be over. And then the Queen arrived. When I say Queen, I need you to understand what that means in Kethral terms, because it's not quite the same thing as the word implies in human context. The Kethral don't have a single monarch in the way humans once did. They have a tiered hierarchy, a sovereignty council at the top, beneath that a series of what translate roughly as domain queens, each one governing a specific territory or fleet command. They're not purely ceremonial. These are functional military and political figures. Domain queens hold real power, real command authority, real judicial authority within their domains. The one who arrived at Varath Station in the 4th week of our rotation was named, as best as any human tongue could approximate it, Varjith on Coral. Varjith. She arrived with an escort of 16 Kethral guards in their full ceremonial armor, that dark, ridged exoplating that caught light like oil on water. Her personal ship docked in the upper bay, and the station's internal feeds showed her moving through the Kethral levels like something oceanic, unhurried, deliberate. She was tall even by Kethral standards, and there was something about the way she moved, every motion too precise, too measured, that made her feel less like a person and more like a force of nature wearing a person's shape. Her presence changed the atmosphere on the station immediately. The Kethral staff moved differently when she was nearby, faster, more careful. Even the security contingent that we'd been operating alongside for weeks got quieter and more formal, if that was possible. Captain Voss called a private briefing. Queen Varjith is here to observe the final round of talks, she said, her voice carrying that particular flatness that meant she was about to say something complicated. Her presence is ceremonial as much as political. The sovereignty wants the Queen present when the final corridor agreements are signed. This is good news for the talks. And for us, ma'am. That was Corporal Ewan. He had a habit of asking the question everyone else was thinking but hadn't voiced. Voss looked at him. For us it means heightened protocols. There will be no, repeat no, unauthorized movement into the Kethral ceremonial levels while the Queen is in residence. No interaction with her escort without specific clearance. No incidents. She didn't say the last word loudly. She didn't need to. We understood. The day everything broke was a Wednesday. I know that sounds mundane. I know it sounds like exactly the kind of detail that shouldn't matter, but I remember it. I remember it was a Wednesday because we just had the weekly squad check in the night before, and Marcus had won 20 credits off Ewan on some bet about the outcome of the next council session. I remember him tucking the credits into his front pocket with that grin, not cocky, just pleased with himself, and Ewan shaking his head and making some comment about the inherent unpredictability of diplomatic outcomes. Ordinary night. Wednesday morning, third watch. I was off rotation, catching 4 hours in the bunk room. Rio was walking the southern corridor route. Ewan was doing equipment checks in the armory. Marcus Webb was on post at Intersection 7. Intersection 7 was a junction point between the human-accessible corridors and the beginning of the neutral zone, the section of the station that neither side claimed and both sides could technically use, as long as they had clearance and a reason. It was a high-visibility post. Nothing ever happened there. Marcus had pulled it 3 times before with 0 incident. He was standing post. He was doing his job. That's all he was doing. What happened at Intersection 7 was recorded on 4 different feed systems. The UEDC had access to 3 of them. The 4th, the Kethral internal feed, we acquired later, during the aftermath of what came next. The accounts are consistent. One of the junior Kethral diplomatic staff, a young functionary named Rathvin who was apparently new to the station and apparently very nervous about the Queen's arrival, took a wrong turn. That's it. That's the inciting incident. A scared young bureaucrat in a hurry took a wrong turn and ended up walking directly into the neutral zone from the Kethral side at the same moment Marcus Webb was completing a sweep pattern from the human side. They met roughly in the middle. Marcus, according to every account, responded exactly the way he'd been trained. He stopped. He held his position. He made no threatening gestures. He identified himself verbally, Corporal Marcus Webb, 9th Orbital Marines, UEDC. I don't want any trouble, in both standard and the 2 words of Kethral he'd apparently been practicing, which by all accounts was a polite greeting. Rathvin panicked. She turned and ran back the way she'd come, and unfortunately, catastrophically, as it turned out, she ran directly into 2 members of the Queen's personal escort who were doing a sweep of the Kethral corridors adjacent to the neutral zone. We don't know exactly what she told them. The translation we got later was incomplete, but from the escort's subsequent behavior, she conveyed something along the lines of having been confronted, or cornered, or threatened by a human soldier in the neutral zone. The escort guards were large even by Kethral standards. The Queen's personal detail were warriors, and they had the kind of mass and density that made even the heaviest human soldiers look compact by comparison. They went into the neutral zone. Marcus was still there. He hadn't moved. He was holding his position, doing everything right. 3 witnesses later confirmed, independently, without comparing notes, that he made no threatening motion, that he attempted to communicate, that he was, by every measure, trying to de-escalate a situation he didn't fully understand. The escort guards grabbed him. I need to stop here and tell you something about how Kethral law works. Or rather, how Kethral law works in the presence of a domain queen. A domain queen has what they call Varcheth, direct judicial authority. Immediate, unilateral. It operates something like ancient military tribunal law compressed into a single person's discretion. If a domain queen believes a crime has been committed in her presence or in her domain, she has the right to adjudicate and execute sentence immediately. The queen had been walking the neutral zone. She was apparently present. We didn't know this from the station feed. Her movement was partially obscured when her escort grabbed Marcus. By the time our station comm system registered an anomaly and alerted Captain Voss, the Queen had already rendered judgment. We found out about it the way you find out about the worst things. Someone was telling us something in a voice that was too careful, too controlled, and the words that were coming out of that voice didn't match the carefully controlled face, and your brain spends about 3 seconds refusing to assemble those words into their actual meaning. Captain Voss called it into the duty watch. Marcus Webb was dead. The Queen's escort had executed him in the neutral zone, on the Queen's direct order, for what the official Kethral communication described as unauthorized incursion into sovereign ceremonial space during a domain Queen's transit. He was on the wrong side of a line. That was all. He'd taken 2 steps too many in the wrong direction, maybe, or more likely he hadn't moved at all, and the line on the Kethral side of the neutral zone was drawn differently than the line on ours. We still don't know with certainty exactly where the jurisdictional demarcation was. It didn't matter. They killed him. They killed Marcus Webb, 23 years old, pictures of his sister folded in his chest pocket, and they sent us a formal communication explaining that the matter was resolved under Kethral's sovereign judicial authority and expressing hope that this regrettable incident would not impede progress toward the corridor agreements. I was asleep when Voss told us. I remember waking up to someone shaking my shoulder. It was Rio. Her face was wrong, not upset in any legible way, just wrong like a picture of herself that had been printed slightly off-center. She said my name twice and then she said, "Captain's calling the unit. Now." I knew, I don't know how, I just knew. I pulled on my boots and followed her, and I already knew. The briefing room was the size of a shipping container and smelled like ozone and the particular brand of tension that happens when 40-something soldiers are all trying very hard not to make any sound or move too fast. Voss was at the front. She looked like she had aged 10 years since the previous evening. Her voice was steady. Her hands were very still at her sides in that way where you know someone is making their hands still deliberately. She told us everything. The neutral zone, the functionary, the escort, the Queen, the order, the execution. She said Marcus Webb in the same flat, precise voice she used for everything, and when she said his name I actually heard, a sound from somewhere in the room that wasn't words. Not a sob, not a shout, just a sound that came out of someone involuntarily, like something had been struck inside them. Then silence. The UEDC is filing an emergency protest with the Oversight Council, Voss said. All personnel remain at current posts. No unauthorized movement. No contact with Kethral personnel. We wait for instructions from command. I looked at Ewan. He was holding one of his books. I don't know when he'd picked it up. He must have had it when they called us, and he was looking at the cover of it, not at Voss. His jaw was set in a way I'd never seen on him before. I looked at Rio. Rio was looking at the wall behind Voss's head, which is what Rio did when she was deciding something. We wait, Voss said again, like she was reminding herself too. We waited. For 6 hours we waited. The UEDC's emergency protest was received and acknowledged by the Oversight Council. Then it was reviewed. Then it was passed to the Council's Judicial Subcommittee. Then the subcommittee chairman explained that Kethral's sovereign judicial authority was a recognized framework within the Oversight Council Charter, and that while the incident was deeply regrettable, the protocol for challenging a domain queen's ruling required a formal petition process that would be submitted for consideration within 30 to 45 standard days. 30 to 45 days. Marcus Webb had been dead for 6 hours, and they were talking about 30 to 45 days. And then the second communication came from the Kethral sovereignty. I've read this communication many times in the years since. I have it memorized. The language is extremely formal. It was clearly written by someone very good at diplomatic phrasing. But the content, stripped of the formal language, was this. The Queen regretted the loss of life, but maintained that her ruling was lawful and final. As a gesture of goodwill toward continued negotiations, she was prepared to offer a formal acknowledgement of the incident to the UEDC, not an apology, specifically not an apology, and would accept the memorial of the deceased soldier's remains being returned to his family with full honors. She also noted, and this is the part that I keep coming back to, that it was hoped the UEDC would recognize that in matters of Kethral sovereign authority, human military personnel who entered disputed spaces did so at the risk inherent to such intrusions. At the risk inherent to such intrusions. That was the line. I read that line and I felt something inside me go very, very quiet. Not hot, cold. The way metal gets cold in vacuum, completely, uniformly, all the way through. Captain Voss submitted her response to UEDC command 4 hours after the second communication. It was not a response most people expected from a career officer who had spent 12 years navigating the careful space between military action and diplomatic necessity. She sent 2 things. First, a formal request for emergency rules of engagement recalibration, citing the extrajudicial execution of a Marine under her command and the demonstrable failure of the Oversight Council's protective framework to provide any meaningful deterrent or remedy. Second, a private message to Rear Admiral Constance Ackerfer at UEDC Central Command. I don't know exactly what it said. I only know what Voss told us afterward. She told us she had written, I have 46 people on this station who are no longer willing to accept that we are guests here at the Queen's pleasure. What I need to know within the next 2 hours is whether Command is willing to back them up. Because what happens next is going to happen regardless. The only question is whether we do it with authorization or without it. Then she came back to the briefing room and looked at all of us and said, very quietly, we have 2 hours. After that we move. Nobody asked move to do what. We all knew. Part 2. The weight of what was OWED. Here is something they don't tell you in the feeds, in the documentaries, in the post-conflict analysis papers written by people who were nowhere near Verath Station when it happened. Nobody gave a speech. There was no rallying cry. Nobody stood up and said this is for Marcus or remember what they did or any of the things that would have been appropriate for the kind of narrative people want this story to be. What actually happened was this. With 90 minutes left on Voss's 2-hour window, Corporal Ewan Packho sat down next to me in the corridor outside the armory. He had his book in his hands. He wasn't reading it. He was just holding it. He said, "Do you know what's strange?" I said, "What?" "I've been sitting here trying to feel something appropriate," he said. "Something that makes sense. I keep waiting for the thing you're supposed to feel that tells you what to do, but there's nothing complicated about this. There's nothing that requires feeling or philosophy or strategy. They killed him. He was ours. We owe him the answer to that. That's the entire equation." He closed the book. "That's the only equation," he said. Then he went into the armory. Rio found me 40 minutes later doing a final check on my own kit, ammunition load, suit seals, secondary weapons, the small things. She leaned against the wall next to me and watched me work for a while without saying anything. That was Rio. She would say things when she had things worth saying. Eventually she said, "His sister's name is Caitlin. He told me that 2 weeks ago. He was showing me a picture. She just got into university. I didn't say anything. I keep thinking about her, Rio said. About what she's going to be told. About the version of this story she's going to get, some official notification with formal language, condolences from a command structure she's never met, a flag and whatever medals they decide he gets. She straightened up. I want there to be something else, she said. Something she can know, that it wasn't just a notification, that there was an answer. She walked away toward the weapons locker. I finished checking my kit. Voss got the response from Admiral Akafer, with 7 minutes left on the window. I was in the briefing room with the whole unit when she read it. She read it twice to herself. Then she set down the comm tablet, straightened up to her full height. She wasn't tall, Voss, but she had this capacity to occupy space that taller people didn't always manage, and she looked at us. Command has issued emergency authorization for defensive posture escalation to active deterrence level, she said. That is the official language. What it means practically is that we have authorization to respond to what happened to Private Webb and to secure the safety of all human personnel on this station by any necessary means. She paused. The Oversight Council has not been notified of this authorization. The Kethral delegation has not been notified. The Queen does not know it's coming. Another pause. This is the last moment, she said. If anyone has objections, operational, moral, personal, this is when you raise them. I will not think less of you for it. I will not record it. I will find a way to get you off this station before we move. Silence. Not the tense, brittle silence of people holding back. The solid silence of people who had already made up their minds before she asked. All right, Voss said. Objectives. Operation Iron Requiem. The name was applied retroactively by the review board. We didn't name it ourselves, had 3 primary objectives as Voss laid them out. First, secure the human residential and administrative levels. All civilian diplomatic staff moved to the station's emergency bunker on level 4, under guard, immediately. Second, issue a formal communication to the Kethral delegation, the Queen's escort, and the station's joint operations systems, stating that the 9th Orbital Marines had assumed temporary security authority over all station systems pending Oversight Council review of the Webb execution. Third, if the Kethral made any aggressive move, any move toward human personnel, any attempt to reestablish control of joint station systems, any action that could be construed as posing a threat, respond with full force. We are not going there looking for a fight, Voss said. We are going there making it very clear that if they want one, we are ready to provide exactly that. She looked around the room one more time. Questions? There were no questions. We moved. The first phase was fast and quiet. 17 minutes to move all human diplomatic staff from their quarters and working spaces to the level 4 bunker. We did it smoothly. This was the part of the job we knew, the escort, the clear and secure, the no questions asked get people to safety routine. Ambassador Delacroix was 70 years old and had been in diplomatic service for 4 decades, and he looked at Captain Voss with an expression that was somehow simultaneously alarmed and unsurprised. Voss, he said, what exactly? Sir, please move with my people, Voss said. You'll be briefed from the bunker. He moved. He was a professional. He understood when a situation had shifted beyond his jurisdiction. We locked the bunker door. We established our own comm encryption layer over the station's systems. The tech on the Inviolate had helped us build that in the 6 hours we'd been waiting. She'd apparently spent the time being extremely productive in her own way. Then Voss sent the communication to the Kethral. The response from the Kethral delegation came back in 9 minutes. It was outraged. Formally, precisely, thoroughly outraged. It cited violations of the Oversight Council Charter. It cited violations of the Joint Security Framework. It cited the unauthorized seizure of shared station systems. It demanded an immediate restoration of the status quo ante and the withdrawal of all human security personnel from joint operational areas. And it included a line that said, and I remember this very clearly because it was read aloud to us by our comm officer who could barely keep her voice flat. It included a line that said the Queen considered this action to be a provocation of the most serious kind, and that the humans responsible would be held accountable under Kethral's sovereign authority. Under Kethral's sovereign authority. The same authority that had killed Marcus Webb. Voss read that line and I watched something in her face that I had never seen there before and haven't seen since. Not anger, not cold calculation, just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when something that was previously complicated becomes very simple. She sent one response. It was 14 words. Private Marcus Webb was under UEDC authority when he was killed. This is our answer. Then she told us to prepare for contact. They came 22 minutes later. The Queen's escort, all 16 of them, plus an additional 20 Kethral station security personnel. 36 armored Kethral soldiers moving through the upper corridors toward the neutral zone. We had 43 people in fighting condition. I want to be careful here about how I describe what followed, because this is the part of the account that has been most subject to mischaracterization. In some versions of the story that circulated afterward, this becomes a slaughter, an extermination, a moment of pure human brutality responding to a minor slight. That's not what it was. It was a battle, a real one, conducted in the confined corridors of a diplomatic station by people who were afraid and exhausted and operating on maybe 2 hours of intermittent sleep. People who were not trying to prove anything to the galaxy except that you do not execute one of ours, and then send us a communication about the risk inherent to intrusions. It was messy and it was loud, and it was terrifying in the specific way that close-quarters combat in enclosed spaces is always terrifying. The walls not far enough away, the sound of weapons fire bouncing and distorting off metal and glass, the way your world contracts to about 10 feet in any direction and the rest of the universe stops existing. The Kethral escort were elite soldiers. They were equipped with kinetic disruption plating and carried standard pulse lances, the short-barreled variant built for corridor work, same reasoning we'd applied to our own loadout. They knew what they were doing. They moved well. They communicated effectively in their subsonic way that humans couldn't intercept. And we had Rio. I need to tell you about Rio in this fight, because I think it matters for the record. Rio set up on an elevated position at the junction of Corridor 12 and the access shaft that ran parallel to the Queen's level. She had an arc sight on her long rifle and a sidearm on her hip, and approximately 800 meters of visibility down 3 different approach vectors. She stopped the first Kethral advance column by herself, not by killing everyone in it by precision. She targeted their point communicators first, the small crystalline nodes on the side of their helmets that allowed their subsonic coordination. Without those, their tight formation cohesion broke. They were still formidable, still individually capable, but they lost the synchronized elegance that made them dangerous as a unit. By the time the rest of Crucible and the other fire teams hit the second column from the flanks, the first column had already gone from an organized advance to a controlled fallback. 22 minutes. That's how long the first engagement lasted. 22 minutes of chaos and noise, and the specific hyper-awareness of combat where everything is simultaneously too slow and too fast. When it was over, the Kethral had withdrawn back into the upper levels. We had 4 wounded, nothing critical, no more dead. The Queen's escort had taken casualties but had not been broken. They would come back. Part 3, 19 days. They came back. Of course they came back. 3 times in the first 6 days. each time more organized than the last, each time adapting to what we'd done the previous time. The Kethral didn't panic. That was both a terrifying and oddly respecting quality of theirs. They adjusted, they recalibrated, they came at you from a different angle. But here's the thing about the 9th Orbital Marines that I don't think the Kethral fully appreciated at the start. We knew this station. 6 weeks of walking every corridor, pulling every watch rotation, noting every junction and access point, and sealing crawl space and maintenance shaft and emergency hatch. We knew this station the way you only know a place when you've been bored in it for 6 weeks with nothing better to do than memorize the layout. We'd walked these corridors so many times we could have done it with the lights off. Which, during the 3rd engagement, we literally did. Ewan's idea. He'd spent 2 days calculating which circuit breakers controlled which corridor lighting sectors and what the overlap zones were. When the Kethral came through the upper access routes, moving in tight formation, relying on their excellent low-light vision, Ewan killed the lights on a staggered pattern, not all at once but in a sequence that moved ahead of the Kethral advance, so their eyes never had time to fully adjust before the next section went dark. The Kethral adapted to darkness very well. They just didn't adapt to moving darkness. We hit them in the gaps. We faded back before they could pin us. We let the station swallow us, and then we re-emerged somewhere they hadn't expected. This wasn't conventional warfare. This was something older than conventional warfare. This was the kind of fighting humans had been doing for most of their history, asymmetric, adaptive, using the environment, making every advantage count because you couldn't afford attrition. During the 8th day, something happened that I've thought about a lot since. I was holding a position at the end of Maintenance Corridor F when a Kethral soldier came around a corner, and we almost ran directly into each other. We both stopped. We were close enough that I could see the amber secondary eyes clearly, 4 of them, 2 sets, all tracking me. The armor was different from the escorts, thinner, lighter. Not the Queen's personal guard, a regular station security soldier. He had a weapon, I had a weapon. We both had our weapons raised. We stayed like that for about 3 seconds, which in combat time is a very long time. And then, I don't know why, I can't fully explain it, I saw something in his face that wasn't enemy. I don't mean I saw something sympathetic or warm. I mean I saw something recognizable. Something that said I am also here because someone sent me here and I am also trying to not die today. He made a sound that my translator caught as something close to a tactical acknowledgement, a status communication, like he was calling in my position to someone. I moved sideways. He moved sideways. We both rounded different corners and the moment was over. I told Ewan about it later. He thought about it for a while. That's the part they never put in the official histories, he said. The moments when the enemy is also just a person doing a job. He was quiet for a moment. Doesn't change what we're doing, he said. Marcus was also just a person doing a job. No, I said, it doesn't change it. But I remembered that moment. I still remember it. By day 12, the Oversight Council was in full crisis mode. The Kethral had escalated their complaints to every diplomatic channel available, and humanity's response had been, initially, the complicated mix of alarm and embarrassed distance that institutions produce when their field personnel do something unauthorized and effective. There were emergency sessions. There were demands. There were a lot of carefully worded statements expressing grave concern. And then, on day 13, 3 things happened almost simultaneously that changed the diplomatic calculation. First, the independent media feeds, the ones not subject to any government oversight, started running the full station feed footage of Marcus Webb's execution. Someone had leaked it. I never found out who. The footage was stark and clear and utterly damning. Marcus Webb standing in the neutral zone, hands visible, not advancing, trying to communicate, and then the Queen's escort grabbing him and then the Queen's direct order, and then. The footage ran on 40 billion screens across human-controlled space in the span of about 6 hours. Second, several allied species, the Von, the Ixari, and the small but influential Chelin Compact, released statements expressing concern about the use of sovereign judicial authority to execute a military observer in a joint neutral zone without any due process. These were not pro-human statements, specifically. They were statements about process, but the effect was to break the unified Kethral narrative that the execution had been lawful, and therefore the human response was the problem. Third, the Inviolate, our ship, our home, arrived in Verath Station's orbital space. It arrived in company. 3 UEDC destroyers and a carrier had been dispatched from the nearest human military installation, the moment Rear Admiral Akafer had authorized our operational escalation. They hadn't been flying fast enough to be called reinforcements for the station fight, but they'd been flying, and now they were here. 4 human warships in orbit above a diplomatic station, where 43 Marines had been holding against a Kethral contingent for 12 days. The Kethral sovereignty also had ships in the area, 2 cruisers that had been part of the Queen's arrival escort. 2 cruisers against 4 warships and a carrier. The math was not comfortable for anyone. Day 14. The engagements inside the station had slowed, not stopped. There were 2 more exchange of fire incidents in corridors that had become part of a contested buffer zone between our position and the Kethral upper levels, but slower, more cautious, both sides taking stock. I was in the corridor outside the bunker, checking on the civilians' routine, when Ambassador Delacroix came to the door. He was a small man with excellent posture and white hair, and the kind of quiet authority you build up after 50 years of being the most patient person in every room. "Sergeant Reyes," he said. "Ambassador, I'd like to speak with Captain Voss." "She's in command section, sir." "I know." He looked at me. "I'd like you to hear this too, actually, since you're Crucible's lead and apparently the unit that's been doing most of the heavy lifting." I wasn't sure what to make of that, so I just went with him. Voss listened to Delacroix without interrupting. She was good at that. He said, "I've been receiving communications from the Kethral delegation. Unofficially, through the station's secondary communication relay, which apparently both sides had independently arranged to leave operational even while the primary joint systems were suspended. Interesting, isn't it?" "What are they saying, sir?" Voss asked. "They want to find a way out of this that doesn't involve fleet action." He paused. "So do we, I assume." "Tell me what they're proposing." "It's in early stages, but the Queen has retained her position. She will not issue an apology. She will not disavow the execution as unlawful under her authority. That's not negotiable for her." "Then we're not talking." "Let me finish," Delacroix said, without any particular heat. "She will not call the execution unlawful. But there is apparently significant internal pressure within the sovereignty delegation from the other domain representatives, the ones who did not come with a Queen's authority and who are, frankly, frightened of what happens if this becomes a fleet action. And those representatives are proposing something the Queen may be willing to accept." He told us. The proposal was this: the Queen would not apologize, but the Kethral sovereignty would acknowledge, formally, in the treaty language, that the Oversight Council's neutral zone protocols had been ambiguous, and that this ambiguity had contributed to a fatal misunderstanding. The treaty would include new, explicit demarcation standards for all joint neutral spaces. All Kethral sovereign judicial authority would be explicitly suspended within any joint zone, and a private reparation, not an apology, specifically framed as a reparation for consequential error, would be made to the Webb family, a substantial one, and Marcus Webb's name would be permanently inscribed in the station's joint memorial record as a soldier of the peace who was lost to an error that must never be repeated. Voss was quiet for a long moment. "And in exchange," she said, "we stand down, we restore joint station operations, the fleet situation resolves, the corridor agreements get finalized." Another long silence. "That's not enough," Voss said. "I know," Delacroix said. "That's why I'm telling you before I respond to them." Voss went back to the unit. "She told us everything, exactly what Delacroix had said, exactly what was being offered. She stood in front of us the same way she'd stood in front of us on that first day after Marcus died, and she looked at every face in that room and she said, 'I can't make this call. I told Delacroix that. This one belongs to you. This one belongs to all 43 of us, because it was Marcus who started this, and it has to be everyone in this room who finishes it.' She told us to take 30 minutes. I talked to Ewan. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, 'The question is what we want the answer to mean.' 'Tell me what you mean.' 'We started this,' he said, 'because Marcus was killed and the Kethral sent us a communication about the inherent risk of intrusions. The thing that was unacceptable wasn't only that they killed him, it was that they thought it was nothing, that they thought we would accept it was nothing.' He turned the book over in his hands. 'If we hold out for more, if we push for an actual apology, an actual admission of wrongdoing, we might get it. With the fleet situation, we might genuinely get it. But that would require a fleet action. People would die. More of us, more of them. The diplomats on both sides would be replaced. The corridor agreements would fall apart and we'd be back to shooting at each other in the shattered corridor inside 5 years.' 'And the other option?' I asked. 'The other option is that we accept something that's not quite what Marcus deserved, but accomplishes something he would have wanted. New protocols that mean the next Marine who stands post at a neutral junction doesn't face the same ambiguous jurisdictional gap. His name on the memorial, and the corridor agreements holding, which is the thing that actually prevents the next shooting war.' He looked at me. 'Marcus believed we needed people willing to stand in hard places and hold the line,' Ewan said quietly. 'Standing the line isn't always about not blinking. Sometimes it's about knowing which line to hold.' We voted. All 43 of us. First time I'd ever seen a military unit vote on a strategic decision during an active engagement. I don't know if it was protocol. I'm sure it wasn't. I don't care. 38 in favor of accepting the terms. 5 opposed, not because they thought the fight should continue. 2 of them told Voss privately, but because they couldn't bring themselves to vote yes on something that still felt inadequate. Which was honest, and I don't fault them for it. Voss told Delacroix. The negotiations moved fast after that. Faster than anything the Oversight Council had produced in 6 months of sitting at a table. Part 4 after. The ceasefire on Verath Station was formalized on day 19. I was standing at intersection 7 when the Joint Operations light went back to green above the neutral zone markers. The new markers. They'd been placed at clearly, visibly, unambiguously demarcated positions, while the negotiations were still ongoing. Delacroix had insisted on that as a preliminary confidence-building measure, and the Kethral had agreed because it cost them nothing and demonstrated good faith. The Kethral representative who came to oversee the demarcation was one of the domain representatives, not the Queen's staff. He was shorter than average for a Kethral, with a stillness that read differently than the Queen's stillness. Not power, caution. He looked at the new markers, he looked at the lines. He looked at me. I don't know if Kethral faces can do what human faces do. I genuinely don't know. But something in his expression, in the configuration of those 4 eyes, in the way the secondary amber pair angled slightly downward, seemed to me in that moment to be an acknowledgement. Not an apology, not guilt, an acknowledgement. This happened, we know it happened. It will not happen again. I held his gaze. Then I stepped back from the line, onto the human side, exactly where I was supposed to be. Marcus Webb's body was returned to his family 4 days later. Full honors, the entire unit of the 9th Orbital Marines, all the ones who were still on station, standing in the landing bay in their dress uniforms while the transport took him home. I had never understood why the military used the phrase, full honors, until that moment. The words had always seemed ceremonial to me, obligatory, something you did because procedure required it. But standing there, in that landing bay, with the hum of the station around us and the stars visible through the viewport above and 43 people who had all gone somewhere very dark together in the previous 19 days, all standing very straight, very still, I understood what the phrase meant. It meant, we see you. We know you were here. We are not going to let the universe proceed as if you were nothing. Marcus Webb was not nothing. He never was. The corridor agreements were signed 11 days after the ceasefire. The signing ceremony was held on Verath Station in the Joint Assembly Hall, the big one, the one with the Kethral crystal architecture overhead that made the light look like it was always just before or just after dawn, the one that always smelled faintly of that sweet mineral incense. I was on ceremonial guard duty, standing at attention in the back corner in dress uniform, hands folded at the small of my back, not watching the dignitaries, just present, just there. Ambassador Delacroix signed for humanity. He used a pen, an actual physical pen, because he was old-fashioned about certain things and considered physical signatures more binding than digital verification. He signed and then he set the pen down carefully and he looked at the Kethral representative across the table and he did something that surprised me. He inclined his head. Not a bow, not a gesture of submission, just acknowledgement. The Kethral representative inclined his head in return. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the quiet, I thought about Marcus. About the picture of his sister, Caitlin, folded in his chest pocket, Caitlin who had just gotten into university. About Ewan saying that's the entire equation, and then going into the armory without another word. About Rio saying, I want there to be something she can know, that there was an answer. There was an answer. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the answer that would have satisfied everyone. It wasn't the answer that gave Marcus back or erased what the Queen had done or made, the equation come out even on both sides. But it was real. It was written into the treaty language. It was carved into the station's memorial record in 6 different languages, all of them used by species who passed through Verath Station on their way between stars. Private Marcus Webb, soldier of the peace.